Hey guys, tonight we begin with something gentle. So go ahead, dim the lights, settle yourself into whatever pillow arrangement you've been carefully sculpting for the past hour, and let your brain loosen just a little. We're drifting into Edo-period Japan tonight. A place where the pine trees were not merely trees, they were pampered, shaped, fussed over, mildly bullied, and occasionally adored like household pets. And, honestly, same energy. If someone gave me a rake, 3 centuries of free time, and a pine tree that couldn't complain, I'd probably shape it into a nice, polite little cloud too. So let's sink in. Slow breaths, soft shoulders, and picture a quiet Edo garden at night. A lantern glows. A gardener in shaved wooden sandals walks across the gravel with the determined calm of someone about to have an extremely serious conversation with a tree. Because yes, that was a real job. Let's drift into the world of people who spent their entire lives persuading pine branches to bend like they were negotiating a peace treaty. Which in which they were. The Edo period, 1603 to 1868, was not exactly subtle about rules and order. Everything had a place. Everyone had a rank. And the gardens? They had aesthetic expectations so intense that even the trees needed therapy afterwards. Of all the trees, the pine was the royal diva. So, long-lived, symbol of virtue, and absolutely unwilling to grow in any neat direction unless someone physically told it what to do. Which is why gardeners spent decades, literally decades, training individual pines into shapes that looked effortless, serene, and natural, despite requiring more human intervention than a modern celebrity PR scandal. If you've ever seen those Japanese black pines with the branches spaced out like delicate floating shelves, that didn't just happen. That took years of plucking, pinching, adjusting, cutting, whispering gentle insults, and occasionally bribing the tree with the fancy fertilizer. These gardeners were called Niwaki, and their lives revolved around keeping wealthy lords, tea ceremony masters, and occasionally very picky samurai satisfied. And what satisfied them most was the illusion that nature had arranged itself to please them personally. A classic elite move. But the pines? They had to be controlled in incredibly specific ways. Gardens were curated to express calm, age, wisdom, and that deeply Japanese aesthetic concept of wabi-sabi, a soft acceptance of imperfection and decay. Which is ironic, because gardeners spent about 70% of their time fighting nature so aggressively that imperfection didn't stand a chance. Let's float over to our first pine-obsessed historical figure, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the third shogun, and a man who adored gardens as much as he mistrusted other humans. Of course he did. The shogun was raised in a palace where everyone was either bowing to him or plotting against him, so a tree that stayed in one place and didn't complain must have felt like emotional support. Ieyasu inherited not only political power but a deeply unhealthy obsession with making every element of his estate perfectly controlled. His gardeners were terrified of him, politely terrified, but they delivered. The pine trees along his walkways were shaped into perfect flat-topped silhouettes meant to evoke old age, dignity, and the slow passing of centuries. Which is somewhat hilarious considering the shogun was in his 20s at the time and had the emotional stability of an overly competitive raccoon. These shaped pines were called karakomi or sometimes Niwaki, a word that roughly means garden tree but make it fashion. To achieve these shapes, gardeners spent the winter months wrapping branches in rice straw to prevent frost damage. They used ropes to pull limbs downward into that classic layered look. And they clipped new growth with tiny scissors designed specifically to avoid leaving visible cut marks. Because nothing says relaxing garden stroll like training your staff to perform detailed tree surgery. Young gardeners trained under older masters in strict apprenticeships. Many lived inside the estate walls. They rose before dawn. They worked until after dusk. And they sorted pine needles by hand, one at a time, because the shadows look different when the needles are pulled rather than cut. You heard that correctly. They hand-removed needles from individual branches the way an irritated parent plucks lint from a child's sweater. One Edo diarist said watching gardeners' thin pine needles was like observing monks at prayer. Another observer said it looked like a man arguing with an uncooperative bird's nest. Both accurate. The idea was to create the effect of age in a culture where age equaled wisdom and authority. If your garden's pine looked like it had endured centuries of philosophical suffering, people respected you more. If it looked too fresh and perky, it was basically the botanical equivalent of showing up in flip-flops to a formal tea ceremony. But nothing about these trees was accidental. The famous cloud-shaped pines, Tamagata, were the result of long, meditative pruning sessions where gardeners removed just enough needles to allow winter light to pass evenly through. Too many needles, and the shape looked heavy. Too few, and the tree looked like it had emotional burnout. One mid-level gardener, whose name is forever lost in the soft haze of history, once wrote that pines must be persuaded, not forced, which is adorable considering he spent his entire career tying branches into submission. It's like someone insisting their cat loves the bow tie while the cat stares into the void planning revenge. But the real secret behind pine training was constant attention. Leave a pine unattended for a year, and it will immediately try to grow into whatever chaotic direction pleases it. Gardeners knew the personality of each tree. They knew which branches were stubborn, which responded well to winter pruning, which needed shading during the summer heat. They treated them like slightly feral family members. Some trees were so beloved that gardeners wrote journals about them. The southwest pine seems moody this season, one entry says. Moody. A tree. Other trees were considered dependable, almost noble. These had names, legacies, reputations. If a daimyo visited, the local lord would proudly gesture like, "Ah yes, behold my pine. It's 200 years old and shaped like the gentle shoulders of a wise elder." Meanwhile, the gardeners in the background were probably thinking about the decades of back pain that went into crafting that gentle shoulder. Among the most dedicated pine whisperers were the professional custodians of daimyo gardens, the massive private estates used by feudal lords. Some of these gardens covered entire hillsides. They included ponds, miniature mountains, artificially aged landscapes, bridges, tea houses, and of course the meticulously trained pines lining the paths like tiny, stoic guardians. Training a pine often required teamwork. One apprentice held the branch, another tied the rope, a master gave the order, and a fourth person stood at a distance checking the vibe alignment. Yes, vibe alignment was basically a job. Does the curve of this branch feel harmonious? They'd ask. And if the answer was no, well, back to adjusting. Even more interesting were pine trees shaped to resemble ancient windswept forms, called sherdere or weeping styles. These imitated trees growing on harsh coastal cliffs. The irony, of course, is that the gardeners spent decades recreating the appearance of struggle in trees that had never experienced anything more traumatic than the occasional clumsy apprentice stepping on a root. Let's drift over now to the slightly gloomy figure of Matsudaira Fukamatsu, a minor daimyo famous for being both exceptionally wealthy and exceptionally joyless. Historical accounts describe him as fond of silence, which is a polite way of saying he didn't really talk to people at all. Probably not ideal for a feudal lord. Fukamatsu's one passion was a pine garden that he redesigned 3 separate times because he kept deciding the trees looked too cheerful. He preferred shapes that suggested a lonely, windswept coastline where a single fisherman contemplates the meaninglessness of life. Very uplifting. The gardeners despised working under him, but the resulting pines were masterpieces, long horizontal branches shaped like quiet brushstrokes, carefully darkened trunks treated with natural oils, and clusters of needles thinned to allow tiny beams of moonlight through. To maintain this moody forest of existentialism, gardeners patrolled every dawn to adjust any branch that dared shift overnight. Another prominent patron of pine artistry was the tea ceremony master Kobori Enshu, who appreciated trees the way some people appreciate poetry. He believed a good pine should express restraint, patience, and the melancholy of passing seasons. You know, classic cheerful tea time vibes. Enshu's pines were not just trees, they were visual philosophy. He insisted that gardeners create asymmetry on purpose. A branch slightly too long? Perfect. A curve that seems almost clumsy? Even better. He believed gardens should feel natural, but only after completely unnatural amounts of labor. His influence spread across Japan, and by the mid-Edo period, wealthy households, political, merchant, samurai, had all become obsessed with pine training. A beautifully shaped pine was a status symbol, the equivalent of owning an expensive sports car today, except this one needed emotional caretaking and took 50 years to assemble. Training methods varied, but the most iconic technique was momiage, the annual pinching of new pine shoots. Gardeners would gently twist and remove soft spring growth to control density. Imagine someone plucking your hair to adjust your aesthetic balance. That was the pine's life. Momiage required calm focus. Gardeners worked in silence for hours. Their fingers became extraordinarily sensitive, able to distinguish subtle differences in texture and moisture. Apprentices often struggled. Their fingers cramped, their patience wore thin, and their sense of pride evaporated quickly when a master looked at their work and murmured, "Too eager." A common Edo aphorism said, "A pine's beauty is the sum of unnoticed labors," which is a poetic way of saying, if you notice the shaping technique, the gardener messed up. Through this practice, many gardeners developed lifelong relationships with individual trees. They watched them grow from saplings into venerable elders. They guided their form year after year, season after season. It's not dramatic to say that some gardeners felt genuine affection for their trees, quiet companionship across decades. And of course, all of this required deep horticultural knowledge. Pines are temperamental. They dislike wet roots. They hate stagnant air. They resent sudden pruning. They tolerate winter cold, but only if properly protected. If annoyed, they simply die, politely but decisively. Gardeners had to read the subtlest signs: slight yellowing of needles, faint cracking of bark, early droop of a branch. Their sensitivity bordered on the uncanny. One gardener reportedly predicted a tree's decline 5 years before anyone else noticed. Another insisted he could sense when a pine yearns for new direction. Sure, why not? Edo gardeners were basically pine psychologists. As the centuries progressed, this tradition evolved into a highly refined art. And while bonsai is the miniature cousin we often think about today, Edo pines were full-size trees shaped with the same philosophy. A 1-meter bonsai might take decades. A 6-meter garden pine? That took lifetimes. Even the passing of knowledge was poetic. Masters taught apprentices not just technique but perception. Observe the tree at dawn, they said. Observe again after rain. Observe after winter wind. The tree speaks. Which sounds mystical until you realize they were training the apprentice to notice how branches respond to humidity changes. By the mid-1800s, pine-trained gardens had become one of the defining visual elements of Edo aesthetics. Travelers admired them. Artists painted them. Poets described them as natural creatures shaped by gentle hands. And lords displayed them proudly as living heirlooms. Some pines even became famous. Visitors would travel miles to see a particularly elegant branch line or a centuries-old trunk shaped like a flowing robe. These celebrity trees lived longer than most of their gardeners, outlasting political upheavals, family dynasties, and the occasional accidental fire. Through it all, the gardeners remained quietly dedicated. Their work wasn't glamorous. It wasn't celebrated. It was slow, contemplative, physically demanding, and deeply humble. The perfect job for someone who didn't mind spending 5 hours convincing a branch to move 2 centimeters. Chapter 2: The Secret Lives of Gardeners and Their Pine Companions. By the early 1700s, the Edo gardening world had become a quiet empire of patience, subtle hierarchy, and obsessive detail. Gardeners weren't just employees, they were long-term caretakers of living sculptures. And, unsurprisingly, their lives were often as peculiar and constrained as the pine trees they tended. Many gardeners were technically part of the household staff of daimyo estates, but their work required a different sort of discipline. While the samurai might train for battle or attend tea ceremonies, the gardener trained for the slow evolution of shape, a commitment measured in decades rather than months. Apprenticeships often began in early adolescence. Children were handed shears, ropes, and stakes, and told to listen to the tree, which is an oddly Zen-sounding command for what was basically decades of repetitive manual labor. The master gardener, known as the Oni Niwashi or demon gardener, not because he was cruel but because he was terrifyingly precise, maintained a reputation akin to a feudal general. He supervised every movement, every cut, every bend. Apprentices feared his gaze. Mistakes were corrected through quiet humiliation, which usually involved a lecture on the spirit of the branch and a detailed demonstration of how they had failed to honor it. Life inside these gardens created intimate relationships, not only between gardener and tree but also among the gardeners themselves. One apprentice might spend months with the same pine, learning how to sense subtle tension in a branch, how to coax it into gentle arcs, how to notice if a branch's angle was slightly off from the imagined ideal. Another apprentice observed the soil, the microclimate, and the seasonal effects that dictated when to prune and when to do nothing at all. Interestingly, Edo diaries reveal that some gardeners treated pines almost like family members, or at least as sentient companions. They gave them nicknames, wrote poems about their appearance, and recorded their growth in painstaking journals. One anonymous gardener described the southwest pine of a wealthy lord as moody in summer, but gracefully submissive in the cool rains of autumn. Another wrote about a particularly stubborn tree that refused to bend east, no matter the care or persuasion, noting that he had begun to doubt his own skill. Training a pine could sometimes feel more like training a child than shaping a tree. Pests, frost, disease, or errant human activity could undo years of work in a single season. For this reason, gardeners often formed personal attachments to specific trees, sometimes refusing promotions or transfers to remain with a single beloved specimen. The concept of lifelong devotion in this context was very literal. Some gardeners literally grew old alongside their trees, and when they died, their apprentices inherited not just the techniques but the responsibility for the trees themselves. It's worth noting that this attachment was not always sentimental in the way modern viewers might imagine. Some gardeners feared their trees, especially the older, larger pines whose branches were thick and unwieldy. A fallen branch could damage a carefully cultivated rock formation, a pond, or a tea house. The trees had personalities, or at least the appearance of them. A branch that refused to grow downward became a source of quiet anxiety. A particularly spindly new shoot could be the subject of hours of deliberation. The gardener's life, then, was a constant negotiation between aesthetic perfection and biological stubbornness. As with many trades in Edo Japan, social hierarchy and apprenticeship were strict. A young gardener might spend 5 years simply observing. They weren't allowed to cut, prune, or manipulate branches until the master decided they had absorbed enough eye and spirit to handle even a small branch safely. The irony was that these apprentices were often physically strong and eager, but Edo gardens demanded subtlety over brute strength. Pull too hard on a branch and it could snap. Cut too deep and the tree would develop a scar for decades. Some masters cultivated almost ritualistic practices to instill patience. One method involved the apprentice sitting quietly for hours beneath a pine during a morning frost, watching its needles glisten and noting minute changes in growth patterns. It sounds relaxing now, but in practice, it could be long, cold, and painfully boring. Exactly the point. The master wanted the apprentice to internalize the slow pace of nature, to develop a rhythm of attention that no sudden excitement or distraction could disturb. Occasionally, trees and humans shared surprising moments of humor. Edo diaries mention a particularly playful pine whose branches would snap back when bent too aggressively, surprising apprentices into minor falls. Gardeners laughed quietly, adjusted their techniques, and wrote poems about the pine's defiance. The emotional life of the garden was subtle, quiet, and punctuated with a muted sense of accomplishment when a tree finally yielded to decades of guidance. Beyond the emotional attachment, gardeners' social lives were also shaped by their craft. Unlike samurai or merchants, their worth was judged not by wealth, status, or martial prowess but by subtle aesthetic accomplishments. Successful garden work could earn a family financial security, extended employment, or rare recognition, such as a personal audience with a daimyo to discuss the alignment of branches along a courtyard path. The social pressure was real. One poorly shaped pine could be seen as a personal failing. This meticulous care extended to maintenance of the garden environment itself. Stones were arranged to complement branch placement. Gravel paths were raked into perfect patterns around the base of trees. Moss was carefully cultivated to provide a soft, natural cushion that visually extended the age and serenity of the pine. Every element interacted with the tree, amplifying or diminishing its aesthetic effect. The pine was never an isolated object. It existed as part of a symphony, a living design where misalignment would echo through the space. Some gardeners became famous within their own circles for their particular style. These stylists might specialize in creating the appearance of extreme age, emphasizing gnarled trunks and twisted branches. Others focused on subtle grace, making younger pines appear dignified. Edo-period guides often describe these differences with terms that sound almost theatrical: silent elegance, contemplative austerity, playful asymmetry. Patrons would choose a gardener not just for skill, but for the emotional impression they could elicit from a living tree. Interestingly, the pine's slow response to care became a form of philosophical training for the gardener as well. Unlike other crafts where immediate results were visible, pine shaping demanded a tolerance for delay and ambiguity. A branch bent slightly in spring would not settle into its final position until autumn, or even the next year. This created a meditative rhythm: work a little, observe a lot, wait patiently, and accept that some elements were beyond immediate control. The gardener learned restraint not as a virtue in theory, but as a practical necessity. Travelers from other parts of Japan often noted the quiet intensity of Edo gardens. One visitor described a walk through a daimyo estate, observing the gentle curves of a pine, the subtle sway of needles in the breeze, and the harmony of stone, water, and tree. He remarked that it was as if the gardener's life had been distilled into a single living composition, which, honestly, is not far from the truth. These gardens were the culmination of decades of human labor, human observation, and human patience, all devoted to coaxing the slow beauty of nature into a form that satisfied human perception. By the late Edo period, pine gardening techniques had become codified, with manuals detailing branch positioning, pruning sequences, and seasonal care schedules. Some included illustrations of ideal branch angles or diagrams of light and shadow patterns. These manuals often read like philosophical treatises, blending horticultural knowledge with reflections on life, time, and impermanence. A perfect pine was not just a tree. It was a living metaphor for patience, subtlety, and aesthetic sensibility. Occasionally, the human drama of the garden intruded. Patrons could be demanding, capricious, or excessively particular. Some daimyo changed their minds about the desired form of a pine mid-decade, requiring gardeners to undo years of shaping work. Others became emotionally attached to specific trees, guarding them obsessively, much like an overprotective parent. Gardeners had to navigate these personalities as carefully as they managed branches, ensuring that aesthetic expectations were met without incurring social or professional consequences. In some of the larger estates, gardens functioned as informal academies for the appreciation of nature. Guests might be invited to stroll among pines, observing the alignment of branches, the weight of snow on foliage, the harmony between stone and needle. The gardeners, invisible yet indispensable, monitored these visits, making subtle adjustments or offering quiet guidance when a branch seemed out of place. The ideal was a garden that appeared effortlessly natural, completely unforced, yet the result of decades of intervention. It's worth noting that these gardeners often operated in contrast to the broader Edo society, which prized efficiency, hierarchy, and punctuality. While most citizens focused on commerce, administration, or martial skill, gardeners were measured by the slow unfolding of life itself. Their work encouraged stillness, observation, and a type of humility rarely demanded in other professions. And in doing so, they created a counterpoint to the often rigid structure of Edo culture, reminding everyone that beauty sometimes required time, patience, and quiet devotion. The most celebrated gardens included multiple generations of trained pines, each with its own personality and history. Some were inherited from previous shoguns or daimyo families, their forms frozen in a carefully maintained state for centuries. Others were created anew, reflecting contemporary tastes or the personal philosophy of a specific gardener. The layering of time, skill, and attention produced spaces that were simultaneously ancient and alive, serene yet dynamic. Visitors and chroniclers often remarked on the meditative quality of these pine gardens. Walking among the trees induced reflection, calm, and a subtle awareness of time's passage. In many ways, the gardens were as much about the human experience as the trees themselves. They demonstrated that beauty required patience, that control could coexist with surrender, and that life, like a pine branch, might bend, resist, and ultimately yield to careful guidance. Even today, the legacy of Edo pine gardening remains visible. Classic gardens like Kenrokuin, Korakuen, and Kairakuin showcase centuries-old trees shaped by hands long gone. Visitors marvel at the cloud-like branches, the careful spacing, and the illusion of effortless natural beauty. But anyone familiar with the history knows that every curve, every bend, every subtle twist is the result of decades of attention, meditation, and sometimes stubborn human obsession. The Edo pine gardeners, in their quiet dedication, remind us that patience is an art, observation is a skill, and the most enduring beauty often emerges from slow, deliberate care. These trees, shaped into perfect forms, are not merely living things. They are testaments to a human rhythm in sync with nature, proof that subtlety, discipline, and devotion can create lasting elegance, even in something as simple as a pine tree. Chapter 3: When Pines Met the Elite, Feudal Lords and Their Botanical Obsessions. By the mid-Edo period, pine trees had become more than a horticultural challenge. They were symbols of status, taste, and personal refinement. Wealthy lords didn't merely own land, they curated living compositions. And the pines, with their slow, deliberate growth, were the ultimate measure of control and patience. Some daimyo approached their gardens with near-obsessive intensity. Take Asano Naganori, for example, a man better remembered for his involvement in the famous 47 Ronin incident than for horticulture, but who reportedly had a profound fixation on the aesthetic alignment of pine trees in his estate. He was said to inspect each branch personally, tracing its curvature with a practiced hand, muttering quietly to himself about angles and density. His gardeners, already skilled, now had to satisfy both the practical requirements of tree health and the sometimes capricious whims of a lord who treated every pine like a live chess piece. And then there was Hosokawa Tadatoshi, another daimyo who approached his garden like a philosophical experiment. Tadatoshi wasn't interested merely in the right shape, he wanted meaning. One branch that curved unnaturally might represent the impermanence of life. Another gnarled trunk could evoke resilience in the face of adversity. He often asked gardeners to document these choices, creating illustrated journals with poetic commentary on each tree. Imagine having your performance evaluated not just on whether the branch looks good, but whether it conveys existential fortitude. Pine training in these estates was a multi-generational endeavor. A master gardener might begin shaping a tree with the expectation that their apprentice, or even the apprentice's apprentice, would continue the work decades later. The tree itself became a living archive, its form recording human care, taste shifts, and historical sensibilities over centuries. Some trees were shaped to commemorate events or victories. Others were pruned to honor ancestors or spiritual principles. The garden wasn't just decorative, it was narrative. Interestingly, not all lords were patient. Some were impatient, eccentric, or just socially awkward, which made gardening a delicate exercise in diplomacy. A lord might demand that a pine bend in a way that defied biological logic. One Edo diary recounts a young gardener being scolded for suggesting that a particular branch would not tolerate a 90-degree downward bend. The lord reportedly responded, "Nature must obey my eye," which left the gardener calculating subtle compromises to preserve the tree's health while superficially adhering to the lord's vision. In other cases, the relationship between tree and elite could be strangely personal. Some lords treated pines as companions, confiding in them during long walks, or framing their own philosophies around the growth of particular branches. A branch that flourished might symbolize personal success, one that struggled could mirror private anxieties. Gardeners became witnesses to these peculiar emotional economies, silently adjusting needles while absorbing decades of human drama. The most demanding patrons were often tea masters or cultural connoisseurs. These individuals measured beauty not only in the health of the tree but in the way light and shadow interacted with its branches. One particularly influential tea master insisted that each pine be pruned to create specific light patterns at sunset. Gardeners would calculate angles, measure shadow lengths, and even reposition rocks to catch reflections in the pond, all to ensure that the scene met exacting aesthetic criteria. It was less horticulture than celestial choreography. Some lords even developed competitions among gardeners. Estates might host small, quiet contests to see whose pine arrangements appeared most natural, most expressive, or most harmonious. Winning was not just about prestige. It could secure continued employment, increased stipend, or even personal recognition from a shogun or daimyo. Losing, conversely, might result in years of subtle criticism, invisible yet persistent pressure to improve. Beyond status, pines also became symbols of political influence. A well-maintained garden reflected a lord's orderliness, patience, and moral rectitude. Conversely, a neglected garden could be interpreted as a sign of mismanagement or personal weakness. This association was especially potent in a culture like Edo Japan, where appearances, hierarchy, and symbolism carried enormous weight. Gardeners, therefore, were not simply shaping trees, they were maintaining the social image of an entire household. It wasn't all work, though. Some stories suggest that certain gardens provided quiet retreats for contemplation or even minor acts of rebellion. One diary describes a gardener subtly encouraging the natural growth of a stubborn branch as a private assertion of autonomy, just enough to amuse themselves without offending the Lord. A slight deviation from perfection could be a whisper of human creativity, unnoticed in the broader formal expectations of the estate. The most elaborate gardens featured layers of pines interspersed with rocks, water features, and moss. Some used artificially aged stones, carefully arranged to echo natural landscapes. Bridges and tea houses punctuated the space, creating a narrative flow for visitors. Every element interacted with the pines, reinforcing the idea that the gardener was orchestrating a living story. It was performance art in slow motion. Apprentices, meanwhile, learned the subtleties of this choreography through long observation. They memorized the growth patterns of individual branches, the way light fell on needles at different times of day, and the seasonal stresses that influenced pruning schedules. Mistakes were instructive. A branch snapped? You learned the consequences. Needles yellowed? You studied soil composition, irrigation, and microclimate. The training was rigorous, meditative, and sometimes excruciatingly slow. Edo diaries frequently note the quiet triumphs and minor tragedies of these gardens. One master gardener recorded the loss of a favorite pine to an unexpected storm, lamenting it for months while shaping its companion trees in careful homage. Another described a particular branch finally bending to his vision after 20 years of gentle persuasion, calling it the satisfaction of decades distilled into a single line. These entries suggest a blend of pride, patience, and subtle obsession, an intimate, almost confessional relationship between human and tree. Despite the care, pines remained stubborn. They resisted unnatural angles, struggled with diseases, and sometimes simply refused to cooperate with aesthetic ideals. Gardeners often worked in semi-ritualized silence, speaking only when necessary, using gestures and subtle adjustments to coax branches into place. Their mastery was not absolute. It was ongoing, iterative, and deeply humbling. There's also the question of time perception. A gardener might spend decades on a single pine, barely noticing their own aging while observing the slow development of branches. Apprenticeships often lasted a lifetime, with the reward being not wealth or fame but the satisfaction of having guided something living to an ideal form. Success was measured in visual balance, subtlety, and the seamless illusion of natural grace. Failure could be catastrophic, at least in terms of personal pride. Interestingly, some pine-trained gardens were used to host formal events. Daimyo and samurai would gather for ceremonies, strolls, and conversations among the carefully cultivated trees. In these moments, the gardens served as both backdrop and silent participant. They reflected taste, judgment, and status, all while conveying the illusion of effortless natural beauty. Observers rarely considered the decades of labor behind the serene scene. The human dimension of pine cultivation extended to daily rhythms. Gardeners rose before dawn to check moisture, inspect buds, and evaluate subtle environmental shifts. They monitored weather, soil, and light, adjusting care plans accordingly. Even minor variations, a change in wind direction or early frost, could influence pruning decisions. Attention to these details was essential. A small oversight might compromise the visual harmony painstakingly cultivated over decades. Master gardeners were also teachers. They imparted both technical skill and aesthetic judgment to apprentices. This included subtleties like branch spacing, needle density, and the interplay of shadow and light. Beyond technique, they emphasized patience, observation, and empathy. A gardener had to read the tree, understand its tendencies, and guide it gently without forcing compliance. This philosophy created a unique form of mentorship that blended craft, art, and quiet psychological acuity. Over time, Edo pine gardens became emblematic of a cultural ethos valuing subtlety, observation, and the slow cultivation of beauty. They were simultaneously private and performative, intimate and public, aesthetic and philosophical. The gardener, the tree, and the Lord formed an intertwined system, each influencing the other in ways that were visible only to those attuned to the subtleties of the space. Even minor adjustments carried significance. A pruned branch, repositioned rope, or repositioned stone could change the visual rhythm of the garden. Gardeners documented these choices meticulously, maintaining logs that read almost like diaries. Some included sketches, notes on seasonal variation, and observations about the interplay of light, shadow, and human presence. These records preserved not only technical knowledge but the lived experience of tending a slowly unfolding, semi-sentient landscape. The social implications of pine care extended beyond the estate walls. Well-tended gardens were often mentioned in correspondence, poetry, and travel records. A visitor might remark on the elegance of a branch, the harmony of a grove, or the interplay of water and foliage. These observations, though subtle, reinforced the status and taste of the estate's owner, as well as the skill and dedication of the gardeners. By the late Edo period, pine gardening had reached an art form that was deeply ritualized, highly codified, and profoundly subtle. Every branch, every needle, and every shadow contributed to a carefully orchestrated aesthetic experience. The gardener's role was simultaneously invisible and indispensable, a quiet labor of patience, observation, and devotion. In guiding the slow growth of trees, they cultivated not only beauty but a philosophy of time, attention, and human nature interaction. Even today, when we see the cloud-like pines in classic Japanese gardens, we are glimpsing the culmination of decades, sometimes centuries, of patient labor, careful observation, and subtle manipulation. Each curve, each taper, each delicately thin needle is a testament to the quiet obsession of the Edo gardener, a living record of human patience, aesthetic sensitivity, and the desire to shape the natural world into a form that reflects both beauty and meaning. Chapter 4. Eccentric Lords, Extreme Pines, and the Politics of Patience. By the late Edo period, pine gardening had become a strange fusion of art, philosophy, and subtle social signaling. Some lords approached it as a hobby, others as a serious expression of taste, and a few as almost a competitive sport, though nobody dared call it that aloud. In fact, in certain households, the garden functioned as a silent court of judgment, where every branch represented a measure of patience, discipline, and attention to detail. Take, for instance, Matsudaira Yoshinaga, a daimyo famous for his mild eccentricities and an obsession with asymmetry. Yoshinaga insisted that his pines be deliberately awkward in their branching, never perfectly balanced, always hinting at imperfection. He argued that a pine should evoke nature's unpredictability while simultaneously demonstrating human mastery. Gardeners often spent decades negotiating this paradox. Too orderly, and the Lord scolded them. Too wild, and the trees themselves were blamed. The resulting gardens were visually striking, but emotionally exhausting for the caretakers. Some lords went even further. One daimyo, whose name survives only as a whisper in historical records, demanded a single pine curve in a loop resembling a character from calligraphy. The gardener, young and inexperienced, spent years coaxing the branch toward compliance. When the loop finally resembled the intended character, the lord visited and remarked that it needed more flourish. The gardener, quietly weeping, adjusted the branch over several more seasons. This was not unusual. Edo gardeners were expected to endure decades of subtle, slow-moving critique without visible complaint. Interestingly, these extreme commissions sometimes had unintended consequences. A branch trained into an unnatural angle could weaken, causing long-term structural problems for the tree. Gardeners were acutely aware of these risks and developed techniques to balance artistic intention with biological reality. Ropes, stakes, and subtle pruning became part of a complex toolkit, allowing the gardener to cheat nature without visibly violating the lord's aesthetic goals. Political considerations also played a role. A well-maintained garden signaled not only taste but also stability. A lord with carefully trained pines was perceived as orderly, disciplined, and capable of managing both men and nature. Conversely, a neglected garden could subtly suggest mismanagement, weakness, or moral laxity. Gardeners, therefore, were performing both horticulture and diplomacy, though most patrons never realized the latter. One particularly intriguing example involves the Hosokawa estate, where a single pine became the focal point of subtle political maneuvering. The tree was decades old, its branches layered in a complex series of cloud-like formations. Nobles visiting the estate would quietly compare the tree to their own holdings, measuring skill, patience, and taste. A gardener who maintained such a tree was not merely preserving aesthetic beauty, they were subtly reinforcing the political and social position of their lord. Failure, even minor, could reflect poorly on the household. The social hierarchy among gardeners mirrored this intensity. Master gardeners commanded respect, but apprentices held crucial knowledge too. Often, a single apprentice would inherit responsibility for an entire estate's pines, including any ongoing shaping projects that had been in progress for decades. The transition of responsibility required precise documentation, sketches, notes on branch tension, pruning history, and even philosophical commentary on the tree's personality. Losing such documentation was considered disastrous. A misaligned branch could haunt a household for generations. Gardeners also had to contend with environmental unpredictability. Pine trees were hardy, but they were not invulnerable. Storms, disease, and frost could undo years of labor overnight. Diaries from the period describe gardeners waking before dawn to inspect frost damage, reposition branches after storms, and carefully monitor soil moisture. In extreme cases, entire branches had to be reshaped or supported with ropes and stakes for decades until they regained structural integrity. This relentless vigilance was a form of quiet devotion, almost monastic in nature. Edo gardens were also theaters of subtle interpersonal drama. Patrons occasionally quarreled over the shape of a tree, creating tension among household staff. One lord reportedly became enraged when a gardener failed to adjust a pine to align perfectly with the shadow of a tea house at a precise time in the afternoon. The gardener, in response, quietly noted that the sun's position varied slightly each year and adjusted future plans accordingly, a clever, invisible form of negotiation. Beyond the lords themselves, pine training affected the social lives of apprentices. Many lived within the estate grounds, leaving little room for personal leisure. They rose early, worked long hours, and devoted themselves to meticulous observation. Leisure was rare and often involved subtle acts of contemplation among the very trees they tended. Some diaries mention apprentices reading poetry under the branches, writing sketches of clouds, or quietly recording the growth of a stubborn bud, an almost secret form of personal expression within the rigid constraints of the estate. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Edo pine culture was the creation of celebrity trees. Certain specimens became renowned for their unique shapes, longevity, or historical associations. Visitors traveled from other regions to see them, and their fame could elevate the status of both the patron and the gardener. One particularly famous pine, shaped to resemble a sprawling crane in mid-flight, became a focal point of poetic and artistic homage. The master gardener responsible for this tree was celebrated privately, though publicly he remained invisible, a humble servant of aesthetics. Sometimes, the care of these trees involved practices bordering on ritual. Winter protection, for example, included wrapping branches in straw to prevent frost damage, a technique known as yukitsuri. The ropes were carefully arranged in geometric patterns, both functional and visually pleasing. Gardeners treated these protective structures as part of the composition, ensuring that even in winter, the tree's form and presence conveyed elegance. The combination of aesthetic, political, and social pressures created a unique professional identity. Gardeners were not merely skilled laborers, they were curators of time, observers of growth, and mediators between human desire and natural limitations. Their work required not only technical skill but deep psychological awareness, understanding the temperament of the tree, the expectations of the patron, and the dynamics among household staff. There were also lighter moments, though subtle. Some diaries describe gardeners whispering to particularly stubborn branches, coaxing them with phrases like, "Come now, you old fool," or laughing quietly at the tree's refusal to comply. While the atmosphere remained disciplined, these tiny gestures humanized the relationship between caretaker and pine. It was a slow, understated humor, easily missed by casual observers but deeply meaningful to those who labored daily in the garden. Edo-era garden manuals provide insight into the highly codified nature of this work. They included detailed illustrations of branch angles, pruning sequences, and seasonal care instructions. Some texts advise the gardener to observe the tree at sunrise and sunset, noting how shadows affected perception. Others emphasize patience above all else. Do not hurry the pine. Let it grow in dialogue with the seasons. These manuals reveal an aesthetic philosophy where human intervention and natural growth were intertwined, balanced carefully through decades of practice. Apprentices often noted the emotional complexity of their work. One recorded that shaping a single branch could evoke pride, frustration, affection, and even subtle grief. A tree that had survived harsh winters and resisted manipulation carried the weight of the gardener's years of attention. Adjusting its form required both skill and empathy, a recognition that living organisms, even trees, could not be commanded entirely. By the late Edo period, some gardeners achieved near legendary status. They were remembered for decades, sometimes centuries, through the trees they had shaped. Patrons would honor these individuals privately, praising their skill, patience, and devotion, even if publicly the gardener remained largely invisible. This quiet reverence reinforced the notion that horticulture, while not glamorous, demanded the same dedication, insight, and subtlety as the highest forms of art or political leadership. The social and aesthetic significance of pine training persisted even as Japan entered periods of political upheaval. The gardens remained spaces of calm, continuity, and subtle social messaging. Patrons, gardeners, and visitors alike recognized that beauty required both intervention and patience, that influence could be exerted quietly, and that mastery involved the careful negotiation of desire, capability, and natural limitation. Ultimately, Edo pine gardens were testaments to human patience and perception. They were spaces where time slowed, where subtlety mattered more than spectacle, and where care, observation, and devotion created lasting beauty. The gardeners who trained these trees left behind a legacy not only of skill but of philosophy, a quiet lesson that attention, patience, and subtle intervention could shape not just a tree, but an entire aesthetic vision of the world. In these gardens, every branch told a story of decades of labor, the personality of the tree, the desires of the patron, and the quiet perseverance of the human hands that guided it. Observing a carefully shaped pine was therefore not just an encounter with nature, but a meditation on time, attention, and the delicate interplay of human ambition and natural resilience. Chapter 5. Personal Quirks, Extreme Obsessions, and Pine Philosophy. By the later Edo period, the relationship between humans and pines had become intensely personal. Gardeners were no longer merely technicians. They were artists, philosophers, and, in some cases, eccentric obsessives. Their lives revolved around subtle gestures, quiet observations, and a patient, often obsessive attention to detail that could last decades. Some gardeners developed what might politely be called quirks. For example, certain masters refused to prune any pine in the rain, claiming that moisture distorted the perception of branch alignment. Others would only work on branches while seated on hand-carved wooden stools positioned at the perfect angle to observe curvature. Some insisted that they must speak softly to the trees, or that certain branches responded more favorably when whispered to in archaic Japanese poetry. Apprentices occasionally rolled their eyes at these practices, but over time, even the most skeptical came to recognize their effectiveness, or at least the aesthetic results they produced. One notable gardener, whose name survives in fragments of Edo diaries, treated a particularly gnarled pine as a lifelong companion. He would rise before dawn to inspect its growth, sketch its form, and compose brief poems about its branches. When storms threatened, he carefully adjusted ropes and supports, and in winter, he would wrap each branch individually in straw to ensure survival. His family, according to accounts, quietly accepted that he preferred the company of trees to most humans. The pine, in return, grew into an extraordinary shape that combined elegance, age, and a sense of gentle rebellion against natural expectations. Such intensity was not unusual. Gardeners often spent decades shaping the same tree, forming relationships as deep as those with human family members. One Edo observer wrote that it was impossible to know whether the gardener loves the pine or the pine loves the gardener, but both seem to matter equally. Another noted that apprentices sometimes cried over damaged branches, feeling a personal failure akin to harming a family member. This emotional depth is a recurring theme in Edo pine culture. Meticulous care was inseparable from affection, frustration, and subtle reverence. Eccentricity extended to aesthetic preferences as well. Some lords demanded impossible asymmetry, intentionally awkward bends, or exaggerated forms meant to evoke natural struggle. Gardeners responded with ingenuity, ropes, stakes, careful pruning, and even tiny scaffolds to support precarious limbs. The result often looked effortless to the casual observer, but decades of planning, observation, and subtle intervention lay beneath every branch. These extreme forms pushed gardeners to refine techniques, experiment with new methods, and develop nearly monastic patience. In addition to their aesthetic work, gardeners cultivated philosophical reflections. Edo manuals often included sections on the metaphorical significance of pine shapes. A straight, sturdy trunk might symbolize moral rectitude. A gracefully bent branch could signify resilience in the face of hardship. Cloud-like formations suggested contemplation and serenity. Gardeners were thus simultaneously technicians and interpreters, guiding physical growth while reflecting on human and natural virtues. The apprenticeship system reinforced these philosophical values. Young apprentices were not permitted to cut branches until they had spent years observing. They learned to interpret subtle signs: the tension in a branch, the angle of light on needles, the subtle interplay of moisture and shadow. Mistakes were instructive rather than punitive. A snapped branch was a lesson in patience. An overly rigid bend was a lesson in flexibility. Through decades of observation, the apprentice internalized a rhythm of care that merged practical skill with aesthetic judgment. Some Edo diaries reveal the almost absurd degree of attention paid to minor details. Gardeners counted needles, evaluated curvature at multiple angles, and even considered the shadows cast on stones or water. One diary notes an apprentice spending 3 weeks observing how sunlight struck a single pine branch in autumn, adjusting pruning schedules to ensure that shadows aligned perfectly with neighboring stones. The effort might seem excessive, but to Edo elites, subtle visual harmony was worth decades of labor. There were also lighter, quieter moments of humor. Gardeners occasionally anthropomorphized trees, whispering to stubborn branches, joking with colleagues about particularly defiant limbs, or recording subtle personalities in journals. One apprentice described a branch as sullen, another as playful. These descriptions were not literary exaggerations. They reflected real, slow-developing behaviors noticed over years of careful attention. The combination of obsessive focus and gentle humor became a hallmark of Edo pine culture. Extreme examples highlight the intensity of this relationship. One master gardener reportedly spent 40 years shaping a single pine to achieve a cloud-like form that perfectly harmonized with a small pond, a tea house, and a nearby rock arrangement. He died shortly after its completion, having never received public recognition. The tree, however, endured, becoming a living monument to decades of patient, quiet labor. Visitors centuries later would marvel at its form, unaware of the human devotion required to create it. Pine training also influenced broader cultural sensibilities. Edo poets and painters often drew inspiration from these gardens, interpreting branch forms as symbols of time, patience, and impermanence. The aesthetic philosophy embedded in pine care, the careful balance of intervention and surrender, the cultivation of subtle beauty, permeated other art forms. Gardeners, though mostly invisible, contributed to a wider cultural legacy of refined observation and quiet mastery. There were also political dimensions. In some cases, the care or neglect of a prominent pine could reflect on a daimyo's reputation. A well-tended garden symbolized order, patience, and refined taste. A neglected one, even if due to biological unpredictability rather than negligence, could suggest weakness or indifference. Gardeners, therefore, performed not only aesthetic labor but social diplomacy. Their work had consequences far beyond the garden itself. Interestingly, the Edo fascination with pines extended to miniature forms as well. Bonsai practice, though separate, shared philosophical roots. Both involved meticulous observation, patient shaping, and the creation of illusions of age and natural beauty. In both contexts, the gardener or bonsai master became part of a slow conversation with living organisms, negotiating growth, aesthetics, and human perception across decades. Edo pine gardens, in essence, created a quiet, controlled world. They provided space for reflection, subtle social signaling, and artistic expression. They demanded patience, discipline, and occasional eccentricity from their caretakers. And they produced beauty that endured for centuries, silently communicating the care, judgment, and temperament of those who tended them. Even mundane tasks were imbued with philosophical significance. Adjusting a support rope, pruning a stubborn shoot, or monitoring needle health was never merely functional. It was a deliberate engagement with time, growth, and impermanence. Gardeners learned to appreciate incremental progress, subtle change, and the interplay of human intervention and natural tendencies. This slow attentiveness became both craft and meditation. In some cases, gardeners extended their observation to the broader landscape. Wind patterns, soil composition, humidity, and seasonal changes were all considered when planning the next pruning session. Every factor influenced the tree's growth and appearance, and every adjustment required delicate calculation. Success was not immediate. It was a measure of decades-long care and foresight. Socially, the Edo gardener was both respected and invisible. Patrons often praised results but rarely acknowledged labor directly. Apprentices could spend entire careers perfecting forms that would outlast them by centuries, their presence known only in subtle records, sketches, or whispered commentary. Yet the impact was profound. These gardens shaped the aesthetic sensibilities of Edo culture, influencing architecture, painting, poetry, and philosophical reflection. Ultimately, Edo pine gardening was a testament to patience, perception, and subtle control. Every branch told a story of decades-long devotion. Every curve, every thinning of needles, every careful rope adjustment reflected human skill and aesthetic philosophy. The gardener's role was simultaneously practical, artistic, and philosophical, demanding both physical precision and quiet reflection. Through this lens, the pine trees of Edo, Japan were more than plants. They were living embodiments of human patience, human judgment, and the quiet devotion that defined the culture of the period. In shaping them, gardeners left a legacy of subtlety, care, and beauty, a legacy that remains visible, centuries later, to anyone willing to pause, observe, and consider the slow, deliberate passage of time. And in that stillness, amidst cloud-shaped branches and mossy stones, one can almost sense the echo of countless decades of quiet labor, patient attention, and gentle, obsessive care. It's a world where subtlety matters, where beauty emerges gradually, and where human and tree coexist in a slow, meditative rhythm that endures far longer than any human life. Some pines in Edo, Japan achieved what could politely be called legendary status. These weren't merely trees, they were living monuments to patience, skill, and obsessive devotion. Certain specimens became the focus of entire lifetimes, with multiple generations of gardeners contributing to their shape, health, and aesthetic perfection. One of the most famous cases involved a pine in a daimyo estate whose history stretched across 4 generations of gardeners. The original master began shaping it in the early 1700s, bending and pruning branches with deliberate care, and maintaining a detailed journal that recorded every adjustment. When he passed, his apprentice inherited the work and continued the careful shaping, interpreting the previous master's notes while subtly adding personal touches. Decades later, the 3rd and 4th caretakers maintained and refined the tree, each respecting the labor of their predecessors while applying their own judgment. By the mid-1800s, the pine had become a symbol of continuity, patience, and intergenerational collaboration. These long-term projects required a remarkable blend of humility and confidence. Each gardener had to honor the work of those who came before while applying skill and judgment to prevent the tree from declining or losing its intended aesthetic. Mistakes were often irreversible. A misjudged cut could alter the overall harmony of the tree for decades. Gardeners learned to embrace subtlety, making minute adjustments rather than dramatic interventions, and documenting every decision carefully. Some pines became famous not only for their aesthetic form but for their resilience. One record describes a tree that survived multiple harsh winters, typhoons, and even a brief infestation, all while maintaining an intricate, cloud-like branching pattern. The gardeners responsible celebrated these triumphs quietly, sometimes recording the tree's recovery with a poem or sketch. These moments were small victories, yet they symbolized the gardener's intimate relationship with both the natural world and the passage of time. Interestingly, the obsession with longevity and continuity created a form of historical memory within the garden. A single pine could record the tastes, philosophies, and personalities of multiple generations of human caretakers. Observers might see the deliberate asymmetry of a branch and marvel at its beauty, never realizing that it represented decades of negotiation between past and present gardeners. In a subtle way, the tree became a living archive of human perception, patience, and creative problem-solving. Not all legendary pines were celebrated quietly. Some attracted significant attention from visitors, poets, and even foreign envoys. One famous estate received high-ranking guests who spent hours walking among the trees, observing the carefully balanced asymmetries, the delicate interplay of shadow and sunlight, and the apparent ease with which the trees evoked natural beauty. These visits reinforced the status of the patron and elevated the reputation of the gardeners, who were respected behind the scenes for their skill and devotion. In extreme cases, the shaping of a single pine could dominate the life of a gardener. One diary describes a master gardener whose entire career revolved around coaxing a single branch into a perfect arc over 25 years. Apprentices were instructed to focus exclusively on this branch, and the gardener himself rarely left the estate, dedicating decades to observing, adjusting, and subtly guiding its growth. By the time the branch achieved the intended curvature, the gardener was elderly, and the tree had become a monument to patient devotion. Gardeners also learned to interpret minor signs in the tree as indications of health, growth, or even temperament. A slight curling of a needle, the subtle bending of a shoot, or a change in color could trigger adjustments in pruning, support, or watering. In this way, the gardener's attention was both aesthetic and diagnostic, merging art and science into a continuous dialogue with the living organism. These observations were often recorded in meticulous journals. Entries included notes on seasonal changes, branch angles, the tension of ropes, and even personal reflections on the gardener's mood or emotional state. In some cases, the text read like poetry, reflecting the intimate and contemplative nature of the work. The journals served multiple purposes: practical guides for future caretakers, records of artistic intention, and subtle philosophical reflections on time, patience, and impermanence. Intergenerational projects sometimes led to subtle disputes or reinterpretations. A new gardener might respect the original vision while feeling compelled to adjust a branch in line with personal aesthetic preference. These adjustments were usually minor but could alter the character of the tree slightly. Historical records indicate that such changes were often negotiated delicately, with apprentices reviewing sketches, previous journals, and verbal instructions from older masters to preserve both continuity and creativity. Pine trees were also used symbolically to convey broader cultural values. A long, elegant trunk might represent moral rectitude, a twisted branch the unpredictability of life, and cloud-like formations the ideal of contemplation. Gardeners and patrons alike were aware of these associations, and adjustments were made with symbolic as well as aesthetic considerations in mind. In essence, each tree was a philosophical statement as much as a horticultural achievement. Some trees became almost mythical, both for their form and the stories associated with their cultivation. One pine, shaped to resemble a crane in mid-flight, survived more than 3 centuries, enduring wars, storms, and neglect. Each generation of gardeners added subtle refinements while respecting the legacy of their predecessors. Visitors centuries later marveled at its grace and continuity, unaware of the decades of quiet human labor embedded in its shape. The extreme patience required also influenced the social dynamics within estates. Gardeners were often invisible, their work largely unacknowledged by patrons in daily life. Yet among themselves, they formed tight-knit communities of observation, advice, and mentorship. Apprentices learned not only techniques but also the philosophical underpinnings of the craft: patience, humility, and the careful balance of human intention and natural growth. These social structures reinforced both skill and ethos, ensuring that knowledge was passed down reliably across generations. Interestingly, even minor accidents could have significant consequences. A branch broken in a storm or misaligned during pruning could alter the visual narrative of a garden, sometimes requiring decades of corrective shaping. Gardeners learned to anticipate such events, using ropes, stakes, and careful pruning to mitigate risk. The work demanded foresight, adaptability, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. By the late Edo period, pine training had become both a refined art and a form of philosophical engagement. Gardeners were practitioners of patience, observation, and quiet influence, negotiating between the desires of patrons, the tendencies of the trees, and the inevitability of time. Their labor created spaces that were visually serene, philosophically resonant, and socially significant. Cultural reflection was an inseparable part of this practice. Poetry, painting, and tea ceremony were often integrated with garden observation, creating a multidimensional appreciation of aesthetics. Gardeners recorded these reflections, and apprentices learned to interpret their own work through this lens. Each cut, each adjustment, each carefully bent branch was part of a larger narrative that encompassed art, philosophy, and the human relationship with nature. Finally, these legendary pines left a lasting impression on Japanese aesthetics. The concept of wabi-sabi, appreciating beauty in imperfection and transience, was reinforced by decades of shaping, observation, and adaptation. Cloud-like branches, subtle asymmetries, and twisted trunks were all manifestations of both human effort and the acceptance of natural limitations. In this way, the garden became a slow, living meditation on time, care, and the quiet interplay of human intention and natural growth. The legacy of Edo pine gardeners endures today. Modern gardens and bonsai enthusiasts continue to draw inspiration from these meticulous traditions, adopting the same patience, attention to detail, and philosophical engagement with living organisms. Each branch, rope, and subtle curve carries centuries of history, quiet obsession, and human devotion, a testament to what can be achieved when time, care, and observation intersect in perfect harmony. Through these trees, we glimpse the human need to shape, understand, and harmonize with nature, as well as the extraordinary lengths to which people will go in pursuit of subtle beauty. Edo pine gardening reminds us that true artistry often requires patience measured in decades, that influence can be exerted gently yet persistently, and that even a single branch can embody centuries of observation, care, and quiet devotion. Chapter 7: Rivalries, Extreme Projects, and Philosophical Meditations. By the peak of Edo-era horticulture, the cultivation of pines had evolved into something bordering on obsession, and with obsession came rivalry. While most gardeners were quietly devoted to their craft, certain estates cultivated competitive environments, subtle contests of skill, and the occasional tension between artistic vision and human ego. One notable example involved two master gardeners at a prominent Edo estate. Both had decades of experience and were highly respected, but each had a distinct philosophy. One favored gradual curves, asymmetry, and subtle cloud-like formations. The other leaned toward bold arcs and sweeping branches, favoring dramatic compositions that demanded attention. Though the patrons themselves rarely intervened, the gardeners engaged in a quiet, decades-long rivalry, each subtly influencing the shape of pines, sometimes correcting or adjusting the other's work under the pretext of maintenance. Apprentices were often caught in the middle of these rivalries. They learned not only technical skills but also the politics of discretion, negotiation, and indirect critique. Diaries from the period reveal moments of tension, subtle rearrangements of stakes, minute adjustments to branch angles, and whispered commentary on the other master's taste. Success required both technical mastery and emotional intelligence, navigating decades-long rivalries with tact and patience. Extreme horticultural projects pushed these rivalries into almost absurd territory. In one estate, a gardener spent 40 years shaping a single pine to achieve a perfect cloud that aligned with a tea house, a pond, and a small bridge. Meanwhile, a rival gardener sought to create a secondary formation nearby, aiming for visual harmony without imitating the first master's design. Their combined work resulted in a garden of extraordinary subtlety, yet every branch told a story of decades-long negotiation, quiet tension, and human ambition restrained by the slow pace of nature. Beyond rivalry, some projects took on almost mythical proportions. Certain pines were deliberately shaped over a century or more, often by multiple generations of gardeners. Branches were coaxed into impossible angles, trunks bent subtly over time, and cloud-like formations refined slowly to achieve visual balance. The work required extraordinary patience, careful documentation, and an almost obsessive devotion to detail. Even minor errors could have consequences lasting decades, requiring correction by successors who were bound by respect for both the tree and the intentions of previous masters. Philosophical reflection was inseparable from these practices. Gardeners frequently meditated on the passage of time, impermanence, and the subtle interplay of human intention and natural growth. Each adjustment of a branch was an exercise in humility. The tree would grow according to its own tendencies, and the gardener had to learn to influence without dominating. The process became a slow dialogue, a conversation across decades between human and tree. These reflections were often recorded in journals, which served both practical and philosophical purposes. Entries might note the bending of a branch, the tension of a rope, or the shading of needles. They also included contemplative passages on patience, impermanence, and the aesthetics of asymmetry. One gardener wrote, "To guide a pine is to learn time itself. Each bend takes years, each adjustment a lifetime of patience. In this, the tree teaches what no human teacher can." Such meditations reveal the deep intertwining of practical skill and quiet philosophical inquiry. Social hierarchies among gardeners were also influenced by extreme projects. A master responsible for shaping a century-old pine commanded enormous respect, even if largely invisible to the patrons. Apprentices recognized that working on such a tree was both an honor and a profound responsibility. Mistakes were often corrected subtly, and lessons were passed down in whispered commentary, sketches, and indirect instruction. The careful balance of respect for tradition, creative judgment, and technical skill defined the highest level of horticultural mastery. Rivalries occasionally produced surprising innovations. For example, one gardener developed a technique for supporting an aging, heavy branch using a series of concealed ropes and stakes, allowing for dramatic curves without compromising health. The rival, impressed and inspired, adapted the technique in their own work. Such interactions, though subtle, advanced the practice of pine shaping, blending innovation with tradition over decades and generations. Patience remained the central virtue. Even the smallest adjustments were measured in seasons rather than hours. Gardeners monitored soil moisture, branch flexibility, and needle health across years, often making incremental corrections that were barely perceptible at first. These slow interventions produced trees of extraordinary subtlety and elegance, where decades of careful labor were visible only to those with an attuned eye. Extreme projects also fostered deep personal attachment. Gardeners often described specific branches as having character or temperament, noting their resistance or compliance over decades. One master recorded that a particularly stubborn shoot refused guidance until the 5th year, yet its eventual cooperation brought unparalleled satisfaction. Such emotional engagement underscores the intimate relationship between gardener and tree, where labor, observation, and affection were inseparable. Visitors to these gardens sometimes remarked on the apparent effortlessness of the arrangements. To casual eyes, the curves, cloud-like formations, and asymmetries seemed natural, spontaneous, and timeless. Yet behind this appearance lay decades of careful planning, observation, and subtle intervention. The gardener's labor was designed to disappear into the natural rhythm of the tree, leaving only beauty and harmony visible. Intergenerational projects magnified this effect. A pine shaped over a century by multiple generations reflected a combination of philosophies, skills, and aesthetic judgment. Each successive gardener learned from the previous, adding subtle refinements while respecting earlier decisions. The tree became a living archive, embodying decades of human patience, artistry, and philosophical reflection. In this way, the garden became a dialogue across time, where each branch was both a result and a record of sustained human attention. Philosophical reflections extended beyond aesthetics. Gardeners often considered the moral and ethical dimensions of their work. To shape a tree carefully was to cultivate discipline, humility, and sensitivity to natural processes. The act of guiding growth without forcing it became a metaphor for human life. Patience, subtlety, and gentle influence were more effective than coercion or haste. Some masters wrote that the tree taught lessons about impermanence, resilience, and the interplay of human desire with natural inevitability. Edo pine gardens also intersected with broader cultural practices. Tea ceremonies, poetry readings, and seasonal festivals were frequently conducted within these carefully curated landscapes. The trees provided both aesthetic and philosophical context, reinforcing ideals of contemplation, refinement, and awareness of subtle beauty. Gardeners recognized this, shaping branches to enhance these experiences, often thinking decades ahead to anticipate how shadows, sunlight, and seasonal changes would affect perception. Even minor interventions carried weight. A single branch adjusted slightly could alter the visual rhythm of the garden, shift shadow patterns, or affect the apparent balance of multiple trees. Gardeners learned to make these adjustments with minimal disruption, understanding that the cumulative effect of decades of small corrections produced the most harmonious results. Success was measured in subtlety, refinement, and the quiet coherence of the entire composition. These extreme projects demanded endurance. Gardeners often worked from dawn until dusk, observing, adjusting, and documenting changes in journals. Apprentices were trained to mirror this dedication, learning not only technical skills but also emotional resilience, patience, and the ability to engage deeply with subtle phenomena over long periods. The craft became a form of slow meditation, a practice in attention and devotion that left enduring aesthetic and philosophical legacies. In some cases, gardens incorporated symbolic elements alongside pines. Rocks, water features, moss, and pathways were all positioned to complement the trees, creating a layered narrative of natural beauty, philosophical reflection, and subtle social signaling. Gardeners considered each element in relation to the whole, ensuring that the garden conveyed harmony, patience, and refined taste. The trees were central, but their meaning was enhanced by context, creating multidimensional spaces of contemplation. Finally, the legacy of these extreme projects endures. Modern observers of Edo-style gardens can sense the careful labor, philosophical reflection, and quiet obsession embedded in every curve and cloud formation. The trees are living monuments to patience, skill, and subtle human influence. They remind us that beauty can emerge slowly, that time itself can be shaped through attentive care, and that the intersection of human intention and natural growth can produce profound and enduring aesthetic experiences. In the shadow of these legendary pines, one sees the culmination of Edo horticultural philosophy: patience, observation, subtle control, and intergenerational devotion. Each branch tells a story of decades-long labor, quiet rivalry, and philosophical reflection. The gardener's hand is invisible, yet the legacy is unmistakable. Through these living forms, we glimpse not only artistry but the human capacity for slow, deliberate engagement with the natural world, an engagement measured not in hours or days, but in decades and lifetimes. Chapter 8: Spirituality, Rituals, and the Daily Devotion of Edo Gardens. By the peak of the Edo period, pine gardening had transcended mere aesthetics and entered the realm of spiritual practice. While casual observers might have seen only curved branches and cloud-like formations, gardeners approached their work with the discipline of monks, the patience of philosophers, and a deep awareness of the fleeting nature of life. Daily rituals structured the gardener's life. At dawn, the master gardener and apprentices would walk the estate grounds in near silence, observing each tree, noting slight changes in needle color, branch tension, and curvature. Watering was methodical, sometimes performed with specific ceremonial gestures, as though honoring the life within each tree. Branches were inspected, stakes and ropes adjusted, and minor pruning conducted with deliberate, almost meditative precision. Even these practical tasks carried symbolic weight. Tending a branch was an act of patience, humility, and attention to impermanence. Seasonal observances further emphasized the spiritual dimension. In spring, gardeners monitored new buds, noting which branches showed vitality and which required subtle encouragement. Summer brought close attention to sunlight, shade, and soil moisture. Autumn required careful observation of needle coloration and the slow decline of certain branches. Winter was dominated by protection from frost and snow, often involving intricate wrapping techniques and rope arrangements. Each season was both a practical necessity and a contemplative exercise in awareness of natural cycles. Gardeners frequently recorded these observations in journals, blending technical detail with poetic reflection. Some entries described the mood of a tree, its apparent compliance or stubbornness, and even its relationship to neighboring specimens. Others noted the interplay of light and shadow across clouds of branches, or the way water reflected subtle variations in foliage. These records were simultaneously practical, artistic, and spiritual, capturing the complexity of a slow, attentive engagement with living forms. Spiritual reflection extended to broader philosophical concepts. The shaping of pines was considered an exercise in understanding impermanence, resilience, and the delicate balance between control and surrender. Gardeners recognized that trees would grow according to their own tendencies, regardless of human intention, and that success depended on subtle guidance rather than force. The process became a meditation on time, patience, and the careful negotiation of human desire with natural reality. In some estates, pine care was integrated into broader ritual practice. Gardeners and patrons alike might participate in quiet morning walks, tea ceremonies, or seasonal celebrations beneath carefully curated trees. The trees themselves were silent participants in these rituals, embodying ideals of contemplation, balance, and harmony. Patrons often used these moments to demonstrate taste, moral rectitude, and refined sensibility, while gardeners ensured that every element of the environment contributed to a serene, harmonious experience. Even small gestures carried ritual significance. The placement of a support rope, the angle of a branch, or the timing of a pruning session could be symbolic. Diaries from the period describe moments when a gardener paused mid-task to observe a branch in particular sunlight, noting the way shadows danced across neighboring stones. These quiet acts reinforced the meditative quality of the work, emphasizing attentiveness, reflection, and deliberate engagement with time. Edo gardeners often viewed their work as collaborative rather than purely individual. Apprentices were trained not only in technique but in philosophy, learning to appreciate subtlety, observation, and patience. Mistakes were opportunities for learning rather than occasions for punishment. A broken branch, a misaligned rope, or an unexpected environmental event was interpreted as a lesson, reinforcing the gardener's awareness of impermanence and the limits of human control. Some gardens became spaces of reflection for the lords themselves. Walking among pines, observing the results of decades of labor, patrons were reminded of continuity, discipline, and subtle beauty. The garden's composition, cloud-like branches, carefully arranged rocks, and reflective water surfaces, encouraged contemplation of time, mortality, and human influence on the natural world. In this sense, the garden functioned as a living philosophical instrument, shaping not only the physical environment but also the moral and aesthetic sensibilities of its visitors. Spiritual and aesthetic concerns often overlapped in surprising ways. A gnarled branch could symbolize resilience, a sweeping arc the passage of time, and a delicate asymmetry the imperfection inherent in all life. Gardeners cultivated these symbolic qualities deliberately, ensuring that each tree conveyed subtle meaning. Visitors who understood these nuances recognized the depth of human attention, patience, and quiet philosophical engagement required to achieve such effects. Extreme devotion was evident in cases of century-spanning projects. In certain estates, pines were shaped over multiple generations, with successive gardeners interpreting the intentions of predecessors while adding subtle refinements. Each generation engaged in a dialogue with the tree, the landscape, and the philosophical principles underlying the work. The result was a living archive of human attention, aesthetic judgment, and contemplative labor, visible in every branch, curve, and shadow. Ritualized care extended to the smallest details. Branches were observed from multiple angles, stakes and ropes adjusted gradually, and minor pruning time to seasonal and daily light conditions. Even moss and rocks were integrated carefully, reflecting the gardener's understanding of harmony, perspective, and subtle visual rhythm. Each intervention was a measured negotiation between control and surrender, influence and observation, human intention and natural growth. Social hierarchies within estates were reinforced by these spiritual practices. Master gardeners, who had decades of experience and philosophical insight, commanded respect for both technical skill and contemplative discipline. Apprentices were trained to honor these hierarchies while learning to interpret subtle cues in the garden. Knowledge was transmitted orally, visually through sketches, and experientially through long-term observation, ensuring that the philosophical as well as technical aspects of the work endured across generations. Visitors often misunderstood the depth of engagement required. To casual eyes, Edo pine gardens appeared effortless, serene, and timeless. Yet each curve, cloud formation, and asymmetry reflected decades of labor, observation, and subtle intervention. The aesthetic effect was inseparable from the human effort, yet the gardener's presence remained largely invisible, a quiet architect of beauty and contemplation. Gardeners also embraced light humor and personal reflection, even within disciplined practice. Diaries include anecdotes of stubborn branches mocking their caretakers, playful sketches, and humorous notes about minor mishaps. These moments reinforced human connection, providing relief from decades of meticulous labor and highlighting the gardener's role as both observer and participant in the life of the tree. Philosophical reflection extended to ethical considerations. Gardeners learned to respect the living organism while shaping it according to aesthetic and symbolic principles. This balance between care and intervention taught lessons about humility, patience, and empathy. The slow pace of pine shaping became a training in attentiveness, mindfulness, and acceptance of impermanence, a practice that transcended technical skill and entered the realm of personal cultivation. Edo pine gardens also influenced broader cultural and spiritual thought. The principles of observation, patience, and subtle intervention echoed in poetry, painting, and tea ceremony. Gardeners' attention to asymmetry, shadow, and seasonal change informed aesthetic sensibilities across the arts, reinforcing the Edo appreciation for imperfection, transience, and the quiet cultivation of beauty. Even as Japan entered the late Edo period and social conditions shifted, these gardens remained spaces of continuity, reflection, and spiritual engagement. The care of pines embodied ideals of patience, attentiveness, and deliberate influence, providing both practical beauty and philosophical meditation. Gardeners continued to shape branches with decades-long foresight, maintaining traditions that emphasized human collaboration with nature rather than domination. The integration of spiritual practice and horticulture made Edo gardens unique. Every branch was both practical and symbolic. Every rope, stake, and adjustment was an act of careful attention and philosophical reflection. The daily rhythms of observation, pruning, and maintenance were rituals that reinforced values of patience, humility, and subtle influence. The gardener's labor was largely invisible, yet its effects endured for generations, leaving a lasting impression on both the physical landscape and the cultural imagination. Through these gardens, one can trace a continuum of human engagement with time, nature, and aesthetics. Edo pine trees are not merely objects of beauty, they are records of centuries-long practice, philosophical reflection, and quiet devotion. Each curve and cloud formation represents a lifetime of patient observation, subtle intervention, and mindful attention, revealing the depth and sophistication of a culture that valued slow, deliberate creation. In this meditative space, the gardener's labor becomes a bridge between human desire and natural growth, blending artistry, philosophy, and spiritual awareness. Visitors today can still sense the decades of care embedded in each branch, the centuries of contemplation shaping every curve, and the profound patience required to cultivate harmony between human and tree. The legacy is enduring. Edo pine gardens teach lessons about patience, observation, humility, and the quiet interplay of human intention with natural processes. They remind us that beauty often emerges over decades, that subtle attention can have lasting effects, and that even the most ordinary-seeming branches can carry centuries of labor, devotion, and philosophical reflection. Chapter 9: Legendary Gardeners, Secret Techniques, and the Most Unusual Pines. As Edo pine gardening reached its peak, certain gardeners achieved legendary status. These were individuals whose skill, patience, and philosophical insight became almost mythical, quietly shaping the aesthetic ideals of their time while remaining largely invisible to the wider world. Their work, often spanning decades, left enduring marks on both the landscape and the cultural imagination. One such gardener, known only through scattered estate records, devoted 50 years to a single sprawling pine. He began as a young apprentice, observing the tree's natural tendencies before touching a single branch. Over decades, he guided the growth of each limb, gradually achieving a cloud-like form so balanced and subtle that visitors centuries later marveled at its elegance. Despite his accomplishments, he remained largely anonymous, a shadow behind the beauty of the tree, celebrated privately by patrons and apprentices but unknown in broader circles. The techniques these legendary gardeners used were often closely guarded. Knowledge of rope tension, branch bending, pruning sequences, and seasonal observation was passed orally from master to apprentice, sometimes over multiple generations. Written manuals existed but rarely captured the subtlety of hands-on experience. Apprentices were trained to read the tree itself, to feel the tension in a branch, to perceive the faintest variations in growth rate, and to anticipate the tree's response to gentle intervention. These skills required not only technical knowledge but decades of patience, careful observation, and quiet intuition. Some pines developed reputations of their own, celebrated for unusual shapes or forms that seemed almost impossible to achieve. One estate featured a pine whose branches, over centuries, had been shaped into a series of undulating curves resembling waves frozen in motion. The gardener's careful manipulation, combined with decades of careful observation and subtle adjustment, had created an illusion of motion in a stationary tree. Visitors admired its beauty without realizing the painstaking labor and patient foresight required to achieve such an effect. Other pines became notable for their longevity and resilience. Certain specimens survived severe storms, typhoons, and even periods of neglect, continuing to grow according to the principles of cloud formation and asymmetry that gardeners had cultivated. Master gardeners often regarded these trees as tests of skill, patience, and foresight, living challenges that required continuous observation, correction, and subtle guidance. The ability to preserve and enhance such trees over decades or even centuries became a hallmark of legendary horticultural expertise. Secret techniques were often embedded in subtle practices. Ropes and stakes were applied in intricate sequences, designed to support heavy branches while maintaining natural-looking curves. Pruning was conducted incrementally, often in tiny adjustments spread across multiple seasons, ensuring that the tree's response remained graceful rather than abrupt. Even the angle of sunlight was considered when planning interventions, with gardeners carefully observing shadows and reflections to anticipate the visual impact of each change. Apprenticeship was an essential vehicle for transmitting these methods. Young trainees spent years observing before ever touching a branch, gradually learning to recognize subtle cues in growth, curvature, and resilience. Mistakes were instructive rather than punished, fostering an atmosphere of careful observation and measured intervention. Over decades, apprentices internalized both technical and philosophical lessons, eventually developing the judgment necessary to shape trees in the manner of their masters while maintaining their own creative sensibilities. The most unusual pines were often those that required decades-long manipulation to achieve extraordinary forms. One record describes a pine whose primary trunk was carefully bent over a pond to create a reflection forming a continuous, circular visual effect. Achieving this required meticulous planning, precise rope tension, and multiple generations of subtle adjustments. The tree became a symbol of both the gardener's skill and the broader Edo commitment to patience, subtlety, and intergenerational collaboration. These projects were also intensely social. Gardeners worked closely with patrons, apprentices, and other estate staff to ensure that the aesthetic and philosophical objectives were maintained. While patrons rarely interfered directly, they were invested in the symbolic meaning of the trees, which could reflect their taste, discipline, and moral sensibilities. Gardeners navigated these expectations with discretion, subtly balancing creative insight, technical skill, and social diplomacy. Interestingly, the emotional lives of gardeners were entwined with their work. Diaries reveal moments of quiet frustration, pride, and even sorrow. A stubborn branch could evoke years of gentle negotiation, while the successful alignment of a challenging limb brought intense satisfaction. Gardeners often anthropomorphize their trees, describing branches as timid, stubborn, or playful, acknowledging the unique character of each specimen and fostering a deeper connection between human and living form. Secret techniques sometimes involved anticipating environmental challenges years in advance. Typhoons, frost, and drought were all considered when planning pruning and shaping schedules. Protective measures like straw wrapping yukitsuri were applied with both functional and aesthetic sensitivity, ensuring that the tree's form remained intact while reinforcing visual elegance. These practices reflect a profound understanding of the interplay between human intervention, environmental forces, and the inherent tendencies of the tree itself. Legendary gardeners often left subtle signatures in their work, detectable only to those trained in the art. The curvature of a branch, the balance of asymmetry, or the spacing of cloud-like formations could indicate a particular master's hand, revealing decades of experience and aesthetic judgment. These signatures were both practical and philosophical, blending human skill with respect for the natural tendencies of the tree. Apprentices, in turn, were trained to recognize these markers. Observing and learning from a master's signature became a crucial aspect of education, reinforcing both technical proficiency and aesthetic sensibility. Over time, apprentices developed their own styles, building upon the foundations of prior generations while contributing subtle innovations that enriched the art form. The most unusual pines often served as focal points for contemplation. Their forms invited reflection on impermanence, patience, and the passage of time. Visitors who understood the subtleties of Edo pine gardening could read the decades of labor embedded in each curve, cloud, and twist. For gardeners, these trees represented not only technical achievement but a meditation on the limits of human control and the quiet rewards of sustained attention. Extreme cases illustrate the extraordinary demands placed on gardeners. One diary recounts a master who spent 40 years bending and shaping a single limb over a pond, adjusting its position annually to accommodate seasonal light and shadow. Apprentices were instructed to follow precise protocols, ensuring that decades of labor remained intact. The resulting visual effect, a perfectly mirrored curve across water and reflection, was considered nearly miraculous, a testament to patience, subtle skill, and intergenerational continuity. These projects also demonstrate the interplay between aesthetics and philosophy. The form of a pine was never arbitrary. Each curve, branch, and cloud formation conveyed symbolic meaning, philosophical reflection, or moral implication. Straight, resilient trunks suggested virtue and discipline. Asymmetrical, gently twisted limbs reflected resilience and subtle beauty. Gardeners were thus engaged in a dual practice of shaping both living organisms and human perception, guiding viewers' experience with centuries of careful intervention. In some estates, particularly unusual pines became objects of quiet competition. Gardeners, patrons, and visiting masters would subtly compare techniques, forms, and aesthetic results, sometimes over decades. This competition was usually polite, understated, and philosophical rather than aggressive, emphasizing mastery, patience, and subtle creativity. The trees themselves became both tools and witnesses of human ambition, judgment, and the slow, deliberate cultivation of beauty. Ultimately, Edo pine gardening combined artistry, philosophy, and meticulous technique. Secret methods, intergenerational collaboration, and extreme attention to detail allowed gardeners to achieve forms that were both natural and extraordinary. The most unusual pines embodied decades or even centuries of labor, observation, and subtle intervention, serving as living monuments to patience, skill, and quiet devotion. In observing these legendary trees today, we glimpse the depth of human engagement required to shape them. Every curve, cloud formation, and subtle asymmetry is a record of skill, reflection, and patient care. The gardener's labor is largely invisible, yet its effects endure, offering a meditation on time, attention, and the quiet power of slow, deliberate practice. Through these trees, one can trace a continuum of human effort, aesthetic philosophy, and contemplative engagement with the natural world. Edo pine gardening was more than horticulture. It was a slow, meditative art form, a philosophical practice, and a testament to the enduring interplay between human intention and natural growth. The legacy is subtle yet profound. The trees remain, carrying centuries of labor, reflection, and quiet obsession. Gardeners' influence is felt in every branch, every curve, every carefully guided cloud formation. And for those willing to observe patiently, these pines reveal lessons about patience, humility, and the delicate art of guiding growth without forcing it, an art that transcends time and continues to inspire modern horticultural practice. Chapter 10: The Culmination of Edo Pine Philosophy. By the final decades of the Edo period, pine gardening had become less about individual branches and more about the philosophical and cultural ecosystem in which they existed. Gardens were no longer collections of trees. They were immersive environments, living expressions of patience, observation, and deliberate human influence aligned with natural processes. Gardeners, patrons, and visitors understood that these landscapes functioned as both aesthetic and contemplative instruments. Every cloud-shaped pine, every subtle asymmetry, and every carefully arranged stone or moss patch contributed to a narrative of impermanence, resilience, and subtle beauty. The trees themselves embodied centuries of care, serving as both subjects and teachers in the meditative practice of observation. Masters approached the work with what might politely be called obsessive attention. Adjustments were never rushed. Branches were shaped incrementally, ropes adjusted subtly, and pruning timed to seasonal cycles. Mistakes were instructive, as minor errors could resonate across decades of growth. Success required a mastery of time, not only of physical technique, but of perception, patience, and philosophical awareness. Each garden became a slow, deliberate conversation between gardener and tree, human ambition and natural tendency, impermanence and enduring form. Apprenticeships remained central to this philosophy. Young gardeners trained under masters for decades, internalizing techniques, aesthetic principles, and philosophical perspectives. Their education combined observation, imitation, and gradually increasing responsibility, emphasizing patience and quiet reflection. By the time they shaped their first cloud-like branch independently, they had already spent years absorbing subtle cues, the tension in a limb, the play of shadow on needles, or the curve of a trunk influenced by decades of environmental conditions. Some estates cultivated gardens as multi-generational projects, effectively creating living legacies. A single pine might be shaped over a century, its form reflecting the intentions, skill, and temperament of successive generations of gardeners. These trees became repositories of human care and aesthetic judgment, offering insights into the philosophies and practices of Edo horticulture long after the original caretakers had passed. Cultural integration extended beyond gardening itself. Tea ceremonies, seasonal festivals, and contemplative walks were all enhanced by the presence of meticulously cultivated pines. Patrons engaged with the environment, recognizing the deliberate shaping of space and form. Gardeners understood that their labor, though largely invisible, shaped human perception, moral sensibility, and aesthetic appreciation. The work was simultaneously practical, artistic, and philosophical. The spiritual dimension was inseparable from technique. Gardeners approached each branch with reverence, recognizing the limits of human influence and the necessity of working in harmony with natural growth. Techniques such as rope supports, incremental pruning, and selective bending were applied with both functional and symbolic significance. Adjustments were made slowly, emphasizing patience and observation over immediate results. Each intervention reflected an understanding of impermanence and subtlety central to Edo aesthetic philosophy. Exceptional pines were regarded as both aesthetic marvels and philosophical symbols. A branch might be guided to convey resilience, a trunk curved to illustrate impermanence, or a cloud-like formation to evoke contemplation. Gardeners and patrons alike interpreted these forms as metaphors for human experience, morality, and the passage of time. In this sense, gardens functioned as living classrooms for reflection, teaching patience, attentiveness, and humility through the medium of cultivated nature. The most extreme projects highlighted the endurance of human labor and philosophy. Some gardens required decades of care from multiple generations, each gardener adding subtle refinements while respecting the work of predecessors. Branches were coaxed into impossible curves, cloud formations refined incrementally, and asymmetries balanced with extreme subtlety. Visitors centuries later could admire the trees without fully realizing the meticulous, intergenerational effort embedded in every branch. These enduring projects also underscored the relational aspect of Edo pine gardening. Gardeners formed intimate connections with the trees themselves, anthropomorphizing branches, observing behavioral tendencies, and developing emotional engagement with their. Diaries describe playful, stubborn, or timid branches, reflecting the human perception of tree behavior and the patient negotiation required to shape living forms over decades. Rivalries, while subtle, continued to influence practice. Gardeners sometimes competed indirectly through subtle interventions, aesthetic choices, or the refinement of particularly challenging forms. These rivalries were typically polite, philosophical, and intergenerational rather than overtly confrontational, fostering innovation and enhancing the overall quality of gardens. Techniques developed in response to competition, such as incremental bending, rope tension adjustments, and precise pruning sequences, became part of the canon of Edo pine practice. Apprenticeship ensured continuity of knowledge, yet allowed room for personal interpretation. A gardener might inherit a centuries-old pine and introduce minor stylistic changes, balancing respect for the past with contemporary aesthetic sensibility. This blend of tradition and innovation ensured that Edo pine philosophy remained dynamic, subtly evolving while preserving its core principles of patience, observation, and philosophical reflection. Even environmental challenges were integrated into the philosophical practice. Typhoons, frost, drought, and soil shifts were considered opportunities for reflection and subtle adjustment. Protective measures, such as straw wrapping and rope supports, were applied not only for practical reasons but as deliberate, contemplative acts reinforcing the gardener's awareness of impermanence and the interaction between human effort and natural forces. The culmination of Edo pine philosophy is evident in the seamless integration of technique, aesthetics, and contemplation. Every branch, cloud formation, and carefully positioned stone serves multiple purposes: practical stability, visual harmony, philosophical reflection, and cultural symbolism. The garden becomes a meditation, a narrative, and a living archive, embodying centuries of human attention, patience, and subtle influence. Visitors to these gardens, whether Edo-era patrons or modern observers, engage with the legacy of meticulous labor and quiet reflection. The beauty is effortless in appearance, yet profoundly rooted in decades, sometimes centuries, of human care. Each tree tells a story of patience, subtlety, philosophical engagement, and intergenerational collaboration. Even in silence, the gardens communicate lessons about impermanence, human intention, and the delicate balance of influence and surrender. Ultimately, the Edo pine represents more than botanical achievement. It is a testament to the capacity for patience, observation, and quiet devotion. Gardeners demonstrated that influence need not be forceful, that beauty emerges over long periods of attentive care, and that philosophical insight can be embedded in everyday labor. Their work reminds us that even small, incremental adjustments, applied thoughtfully over decades, can yield enduring results that transcend the lifespan of any individual. Edo pine gardens also highlight the social and cultural dimensions of patience and attention. Patrons relied on these spaces for contemplation, reflection, and display of taste, while gardeners navigated subtle hierarchies, intergenerational responsibilities, and philosophical interpretation. The process reinforced values of humility, respect for nature, and intergenerational continuity, ensuring that gardens functioned as both aesthetic spaces and living ethical exercises. By observing the most legendary pines today, one can trace the culmination of Edo horticultural philosophy. Every cloud formation, asymmetrical branch, and curved trunk reflects decades of attentive care, intergenerational collaboration, and subtle philosophical reflection. Visitors are invited not only to admire aesthetic harmony but also to reflect on time, patience, and the interplay of human and natural forces. In the quiet, meditative presence of these trees, we are reminded that true mastery is often invisible, achieved through patience, subtlety, and sustained attention. The Edo gardener's legacy endures, a bridge between human intention and natural growth, where slow, deliberate practice cultivates both beauty and philosophical insight. Ultimately, Edo pine gardening embodies a delicate balance between effort and surrender, observation and intervention, human desire and natural tendency. It demonstrates the power of slow, attentive practice and the enduring impact of subtle, intergenerational care. These gardens, shaped over centuries, remain living monuments to patience, philosophical reflection, and the quiet, persistent cultivation of beauty. Chapter 11: Modern Legacy, Edo Pines and Bonsai Influence. The influence of Edo-era pine gardening extends far beyond the historical gardens themselves, seeping into modern Japanese horticulture, bonsai practice, and cultural aesthetics. While Edo gardeners devoted decades, sometimes lifetimes, to shaping full-size trees, their principles, patience, observation, subtle influence, and philosophical reflection have become foundational to contemporary practices. Bonsai, in particular, owes much to these traditions. Miniature pines, meticulously cultivated in pots, encapsulate the same philosophies as their full-sized Edo counterparts. Each branch is guided incrementally, ropes and supports applied subtly, and pruning executed with patient observation over years. Bonsai artists often study Edo-era journals and surviving estate gardens to learn not just techniques but the philosophical underpinnings of long-term cultivation. The emphasis on impermanence and asymmetry, so central to Edo pine philosophy, is particularly evident in bonsai aesthetics. Small, twisted branches mimic the curves and cloud formations of ancient pines, while asymmetrical balance reflects the wabi-sabi ideal, beauty in imperfection, transience, and subtlety. Bonsai artists adopt this philosophy to create compositions that feel both natural and deliberate, echoing the meditative, reflective approach pioneered centuries earlier. Modern gardeners continue to embrace intergenerational thinking, albeit on a smaller scale. A bonsai may be shaped by one artist for decades, then passed to an apprentice who continues its cultivation, respecting prior adjustments while applying their own subtle refinements. In this way, the tree becomes a living dialogue across generations, a miniature echo of the grand, multi-century projects of Edo gardens. Even contemporary full-scale gardens remain deeply influenced by Edo principles. Landscape designers continue to emphasize patient observation, incremental shaping, and philosophical reflection in tree selection, pruning, and layout. The careful interplay of light, shadow, and perspective, long central to Edo practice, remains essential. Trees are trained not merely for aesthetic pleasure but to evoke contemplation, subtle narrative, and the quiet, meditative rhythm of time passing. Some modern gardeners explicitly study historical techniques, attempting to replicate cloud pruning, trunk bending, and rope supports as faithfully as possible. Workshops and apprenticeships often emphasize patience, quiet observation, and philosophical awareness as much as technical skill. Students learn to watch subtle movements in growth, recognize the temperament of a branch, and understand how incremental adjustments accumulate into centuries-long forms. Interestingly, humor and personal reflection remain part of modern practice. Bonsai artists, like Edo gardeners before them, often anthropomorphize branches, noting a stubborn shoot or a playful curvature. Diaries and blogs describe the slow negotiation between human intention and tree growth, with playful commentary on minor setbacks or surprising cooperation from branches. This continuity underscores the deeply human dimension of pine cultivation, a blend of technical skill, philosophical reflection, and quiet, persistent engagement. Modern gardens also reflect the social and cultural lessons of Edo pine practice. Patrons, landscape designers, and gardeners collaborate to create spaces that embody intergenerational knowledge, aesthetic refinement, and subtle philosophical meaning. The human influence is carefully calibrated to be visible yet unobtrusive, ensuring that the garden communicates harmony without revealing the decades of patient labor behind it. Bonsai competitions, exhibitions, and study groups often highlight the enduring influence of Edo methods. Artists may present trees that replicate centuries-old forms, cloud arrangements, or asymmetrical balances. Judges and observers evaluate not just visual appeal but also evidence of patient cultivation, careful shaping, and adherence to philosophical principles. Trees are appreciated for their subtlety, resilience, and capacity to reflect human care over time. The meditative dimension remains central. Both full-scale gardens and bonsai practice emphasize the process of observation as much as the final aesthetic. Watching a branch bend slowly over years, noting the subtle changes in color or curvature, and understanding the interaction between sunlight, shadow, and surrounding elements. These practices reinforce mindfulness, patience, and philosophical reflection. The gardener's role is as much contemplative as it is technical. Cultural education also preserves Edo philosophy. Museums, historical gardens, and botanical institutions in Japan and abroad include Edo pine gardens in their programming, teaching visitors about long-term cultivation, observation, and philosophical engagement. Workshops emphasize subtle intervention, seasonal awareness, and intergenerational knowledge transfer, demonstrating that the legacy of Edo gardeners remains profoundly relevant. Environmental awareness is another modern dimension. Edo gardeners were early practitioners of what might be called sustainable horticulture. They understood the limits of intervention, respected the tree's natural tendencies, and worked in harmony with seasonal cycles. Contemporary gardeners and bonsai artists continue this practice, emphasizing observation, natural growth patterns, and subtle correction rather than aggressive modification. The philosophical and practical overlap reinforces continuity across centuries. Even small adjustments remain meaningful. A single bent branch, a carefully pruned twig, or subtle placement in sunlight continues to require attention, patience, and quiet reflection. Modern bonsai practitioners are reminded that decades-long outcomes result from daily observation, small interventions, and a deep understanding of both natural processes and aesthetic principles. The labor is incremental, cumulative, and reflective of centuries of inherited knowledge. The Edo emphasis on intergenerational care also informs cultural continuity. Bonsai collections are often passed from teacher to student, preserving subtle techniques, aesthetic judgment, and philosophical insight. Full-scale gardens similarly rely on ongoing observation and maintenance by multiple generations, ensuring that forms created over decades or centuries endure and evolve in alignment with historical principles. Modern documentation, photography, video, and digital journaling enhances this continuity, though subtly. Whereas Edo gardeners relied on handwritten journals and sketches, contemporary practitioners use technology to record growth patterns, pruning schedules, and seasonal changes. Yet the underlying philosophy remains: observation, patience, subtle influence, and philosophical reflection. The tools may have changed, but the principles endure. Philosophical reflection continues to be integral. Gardeners and bonsai artists meditate on impermanence, subtle beauty, patience, and human influence over nature. Each branch serves as both aesthetic element and philosophical prompt, inviting contemplation of time, mortality, and the interplay between effort and surrender. Modern practice thus preserves not only technical skill but also the meditative and reflective qualities central to Edo pine philosophy. Visitors today, whether in large estates or bonsai exhibitions, often experience the same quiet contemplation Edo-era patrons would have felt. Trees shaped with patience, subtlety, and philosophical awareness communicate lessons about observation, care, and the delicate balance between human intention and natural growth. Even casual observers may sense the accumulation of decades or centuries of attention, creating a contemplative experience that transcends mere visual appreciation. In some cases, modern practitioners intentionally recreate famous Edo pine forms, cloud arrangements, and asymmetrical balances. These efforts highlight continuity across time, blending historical fidelity with contemporary interpretation. Each project becomes both technical exercise and philosophical reflection, preserving the legacy of Edo horticulture while allowing subtle adaptation to current conditions and sensibilities. Ultimately, the Edo pine legacy is enduring because it combines aesthetics, philosophy, and human patience in a way that transcends centuries. Bonsai, modern gardens, and cultural education all reflect these principles, reminding us that beauty emerges slowly, subtly, and through sustained attention. The work of Edo gardeners continues to teach lessons about patience, observation, humility, and the quiet power of intergenerational care. Through modern practice, the centuries of labor embedded in each branch, curve, and cloud formation remain visible to those who observe carefully. Every subtle adjustment, rope placement, and bend is a continuation of the meditative, patient, and reflective engagement pioneered by Edo gardeners. In this way, the legacy of Edo pine philosophy lives on, influencing not only horticultural practice but the cultural imagination, ethical reflection, and aesthetic appreciation in contemporary Japan and beyond. Chapter 12: Extreme Modern Adaptations and the Persistence of Edo Philosophy. In contemporary Japan, Edo pine philosophy has found a new home in hybrid gardens that blend historical tradition with modern design sensibilities. While classic principles of cloud pruning, asymmetry, and contemplative layout remain central, some gardeners experiment with scale, materials, and integration of technology, creating spaces that feel both timeless and subtly contemporary. One notable trend involves living sculptures, where pines are shaped not only according to traditional cloud patterns but also to complement modern architectural elements. Branches may arc over minimalist concrete pathways, interact with reflective water features, or frame contemporary tea houses in ways that echo Edo-era aesthetics while introducing visual contrast. These adaptations honor centuries of practice while demonstrating how flexible Edo philosophy can be when applied thoughtfully. Despite the modern context, patience remains paramount. Even when integrating contemporary design elements, gardeners adhere to incremental adjustment, subtle observation, and long-term planning. Branches are bent over years rather than months, rope supports are applied with gentle precision, and minor pruning is spaced across seasons to preserve the natural rhythm of growth. The philosophy of slow, deliberate engagement persists, ensuring that the trees maintain harmony with both traditional ideals and modern innovation. Hybrid gardens also showcase intergenerational collaboration. Contemporary gardeners often work alongside apprentices, family members, or cross-disciplinary teams combining horticulture, architecture, and cultural studies. The principles of Edo pine shaping, patient observation, philosophical reflection, subtle intervention remain central, but the creative application is sometimes expanded to address aesthetic challenges posed by contemporary design. The result is a living dialogue across centuries, where historical principles inform modern experimentation. Some of the most extreme adaptations involve integrating large-scale bonsai techniques into public or semi-public spaces. Trees are trained in miniature form to reflect cloud formations of ancient Edo specimens, then scaled up or arranged to interact with water, stone, or architectural features. These compositions create immersive environments in which the principles of Edo pine philosophy, patience, asymmetry, impermanence, and subtle beauty are experienced physically and viscerally. Visitors move through the garden as if traversing a centuries-old meditation, witnessing deliberate human influence manifesting in living form. Humor and human reflection persist in modern practice. Diaries, blogs, and social media posts reveal gardeners anthropomorphizing stubborn branches, joking about unexpected growth, or celebrating minor victories in shaping particularly challenging limbs. This light, gentle humor mirrors Edo practices, reminding us that even centuries of careful, meditative work do not preclude the human desire to connect, reflect, and occasionally laugh quietly at the foibles of living trees. Environmental awareness remains a central concern. Modern gardeners respect natural cycles, adjusting irrigation, pruning schedules, and supports according to seasonal variations. Climate change introduces new variables, prompting gardeners to observe weather patterns, soil conditions, and tree health with even greater diligence. In this way, contemporary practice extends Edo philosophy into a modern environmental consciousness, blending technical skill with ecological mindfulness. Hybrid gardens frequently serve educational purposes. Workshops, guided tours, and participatory pruning sessions allow visitors to engage with centuries-old techniques while understanding the philosophical principles underlying Edo practice. Observers learn to notice subtle asymmetries, appreciate the cumulative effect of incremental interventions, and reflect on the meditative, patient process that produces beauty over decades or centuries. This educational dimension ensures the endurance of Edo principles beyond private estates, making the philosophy accessible to a wider audience. Extreme cases demonstrate remarkable continuity. A contemporary gardener may work on a tree shaped originally over a century ago, carefully maintaining the form while introducing minor adjustments in alignment with environmental changes or aesthetic reinterpretation. These trees become living palimpsests, preserving the intentions of Edo-era masters while accommodating the needs and sensibilities of modern caretakers. The labor is slow, subtle, and continuous, a practice in humility, observation, and intergenerational respect. The integration of modern aesthetics also reinforces philosophical lessons. Curved branches aligned with reflective water surfaces, for instance, encourage contemplation of impermanence and transient beauty. Asymmetrical groupings create subtle visual tension, prompting viewers to reflect on the balance between natural growth and human guidance. Even minimalist interventions, such as carefully placed stones or subtle pathways, evoke the same Edo ideals of patient observation and philosophical reflection, now translated into contemporary contexts. Apprenticeship continues to play a vital role. Young gardeners learn both technical and philosophical skills by participating in the slow shaping of long-lived trees, observing the interplay of growth patterns, seasonal changes, and intergenerational decisions. They are trained to respect previous generations' work while cultivating the judgment and sensitivity necessary to make small, thoughtful adjustments. This ensures continuity of both aesthetic and philosophical principles, preserving centuries of accumulated knowledge. Subtle humor and human narrative are woven into these practices. Gardeners often refer to specific branches as stubborn or mischievous, chronicling minor victories, setbacks, or unexpected growth patterns. Observers may note the satisfaction derived from a perfectly aligned curve or the frustration of a branch that refuses correction. These light-hearted reflections provide insight into the human dimension of a centuries-old practice, demonstrating continuity of both skill and temperament across generations. Chapter 12. Extreme Modern Adaptations and the Persistence of Edo Philosophy. In contemporary Japan, Edo pine philosophy has found a new home in hybrid gardens that blend historical tradition with modern design sensibilities. While classic principles of cloud pruning, asymmetry, and contemplative layout remain central, some gardeners experiment with scale, materials, and integration of technology, creating spaces that feel both timeless and subtly contemporary. One notable trend involves living sculptures, where pines are shaped not only according to traditional cloud patterns but also to complement modern architectural elements. Branches may arc over minimalist concrete pathways, interact with reflective water features, or frame contemporary tea houses in ways that echo Edo-era aesthetics while introducing visual contrast. These adaptations honor centuries of practice while demonstrating how flexible Edo philosophy can be when applied thoughtfully. Despite the modern context, patience remains paramount. Even when integrating contemporary design elements, gardeners adhere to incremental adjustment, subtle observation, and long-term planning. Branches are bent over years rather than months. Rope supports are applied with gentle precision, and minor pruning is spaced across seasons to preserve the natural rhythm of growth. The philosophy of slow, deliberate engagement persists, ensuring that the trees maintain harmony with both traditional ideals and modern innovation. Hybrid gardens also showcase intergenerational collaboration. Contemporary gardeners often work alongside apprentices, family members, or cross-disciplinary teams combining horticulture, architecture, and cultural studies. The principles of Edo pine shaping, patient observation, philosophical reflection, subtle intervention remain central, but the creative application is sometimes expanded to address aesthetic challenges posed by contemporary design. The result is a living dialogue across centuries, where historical principles inform modern experimentation. Some of the most extreme adaptations involve integrating large-scale bonsai techniques into public or semi-public spaces. Trees are trained in miniature form to reflect cloud formations of ancient Edo specimens, then scaled up or arranged to interact with water, stone, or architectural features. These compositions create immersive environments in which the principles of Edo pine philosophy, patience, asymmetry, impermanence, and subtle beauty are experienced physically and viscerally. Visitors move through the garden as if traversing a centuries-old meditation, witnessing deliberate human influence manifesting in living form. Humor and human reflection persist in modern practice. Diaries, blogs, and social media posts reveal gardeners anthropomorphizing stubborn branches, joking about unexpected growth, or celebrating minor victories in shaping particularly challenging limbs. This light, gentle humor mirrors Edo practices, reminding us that even centuries of careful, meditative work do not preclude the human desire to connect, reflect, and occasionally laugh quietly at the foibles of living trees. Environmental awareness remains a central concern. Modern gardeners respect natural cycles, adjusting irrigation, pruning schedules, and supports according to seasonal variations. Climate change introduces new variables, prompting gardeners to observe weather patterns, soil conditions, and tree health with even greater diligence. In this way, contemporary practice extends Edo philosophy into a modern environmental consciousness, blending technical skill with ecological mindfulness. Hybrid gardens frequently serve educational purposes. Workshops, Guided tours and participatory pruning sessions allow visitors to engage with centuries-old techniques while understanding the philosophical principles underlying Edo practice. Observers learn to notice subtle asymmetries, appreciate the cumulative effect of incremental interventions, and reflect on the meditative, patient process that produces beauty over decades or centuries. This educational dimension ensures the endurance of Edo principles beyond private estates, making the philosophy accessible to a wider audience. Extreme cases demonstrate remarkable continuity. A contemporary gardener may work on a tree shaped originally over a century ago, carefully maintaining the form while introducing minor adjustments in alignment with environmental changes or aesthetic reinterpretation. These trees become living palimpsests, preserving the intentions of Edo-era masters while accommodating the needs and sensibilities of modern caretakers. The labor is slow, subtle, and continuous, a practice in humility, observation, and intergenerational respect. The integration of modern aesthetics also reinforces philosophical lessons. Curved branches aligned with reflective water surfaces, for instance, encourage contemplation of impermanence and transient beauty. Asymmetrical groupings create subtle visual tension, prompting viewers to reflect on the balance between natural growth and human guidance. Even minimalist interventions, such as carefully placed stones or subtle pathways, evoke the same Edo ideals of patient observation and philosophical reflection, now translated into contemporary contexts. Apprenticeship continues to play a vital role. Young gardeners learn both technical and philosophical skills by participating in the slow shaping of long-lived trees, observing the interplay of growth patterns, seasonal changes, and intergenerational decisions. They are trained to respect previous generations' work while cultivating the judgment and sensitivity necessary to make small, thoughtful adjustments. This ensures continuity of both aesthetic and philosophical principles, preserving centuries of accumulated knowledge. Subtle humor and human narrative are woven into these practices. Gardeners often refer to specific branches as stubborn or mischievous, chronicling minor victories, setbacks, or unexpected growth patterns. Observers may note the satisfaction derived from a perfectly aligned curve or the frustration of a branch that refuses correction. These light-hearted reflections provide insight into the human dimension of a centuries-old practice, demonstrating continuity of both skill and temperament across generations.